Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Gaming Telecom video, we're going to be reviewing Intel's 7820X processor, which of course is part of the Skylake-X family. Now, for those who don't know, we've already reviewed the 7900X along with MSI's Gaming AC X299 motherboard. So if you want more information on the Skylake-X platform, which we will briefly touch upon in this video, along with perhaps a motherboard as well, then check out that review, which will be linked, of course, in the video description. With that said, this review is primarily going to be focused upon the 7820X and ask and answer a very simple question. Should you plonk your cash down and purchase this processor? Or would you be better off to buy perhaps one of the Threadrippers, the Ryzen 7, or perhaps one of the bigger brothers, for example, the 7900X? The 7820X is a direct replacement for the 6900K, which was a Broadwell E processor. It's an 8-core, 16-thread CPU running at 3.6 GHz for the base, 4.3 GHz for Turbo 2, that is if all processor cores are active, and 4.5 GHz for Turbo 3. Perhaps Skylake-X's biggest change over the older Broadwell E sibling is the new caching system, where we see the level 2 cache raised from 256 KB per core to an impressive 1 MB per core. Of course, die space isn't infinite, and we see a proportionally smaller level 3 cache as a result, shrinking level 3 down to just 11 MB compared to Broadwell E's 6900K's 20 MB total. Intel believe this will reduce the chances that needed data will be plonked in the higher latency and slower level 3 victim cache, thus boosting IPC and efficiency. This cache is non-inclusive rather than inclusive, so data won't be mirrored across cache. In other words, it's exclusive data. So while level 3 has been shrunk, because of this exclusivity, space is slightly less of an issue. Intel have also made a few other changes, including AVX512 support, which in theory at least will allow applications using this extension to notably run faster than what Ryzen or older Intel architectures will be capable. As of right now, Intel are offering developers guidance to help take advantage of the wider extension, as we really see this as an enterprise-level software being the primary benefactor, and it will likely take longer for a wider gamut of customer-facing applications to take full advantage of AVX512. With that said, for those looking to purchase a CPU with the notion of using AVX512, then it's worth noting that 8 cores or below will only offer 1 FMA for AVX512, with 10 cores or above in the Skylake-X architecture offering 2 FMAs. Finally, the other major architecture tweak comes in the form of improved Intel speed shift technology. Essentially, this allows the processor to control its own P states, and in turn, with the OS relinquishing control of power and frequency, Skylake-X is able to adjust its frequency at a much faster rate than what the operating system could do alone. According to Intel's own marketing slides, this allows the processor to hit maximum clock frequencies from idle in just 35 milliseconds, a far cry of the 100 ms of the older traditional and legacy implementation. This should allow the system to feel considerably more responsive. PCIe lanes are by far the most controversial aspect of Skylake-X, with both the 7820X and 7800X having just 28 lanes each, while the Kaby Lake X line has just a paltry 16. The absence of PCIe lanes is definitely one of the major weaknesses of this particular processor, but we'll talk more about that towards the conclusion of this video. For benchmarking, we ran the 7820X across a myriad of different applications. Since we've also tested the i9-7900X previously, we can stick those results and a bunch of others in for comparison. The test system we're running is an MSI X299 Gaming N7 AC motherboard with latest BIOS, a GTX 1080 reference design, and Ballistix Sports RAM running at 2666 MHz, along with a freshly installed Windows 10 and patched software. We'll be starting things out with game performance, and it's pretty obvious that there's not a great deal of difference between a 7820X and, say, a 7900X in Far Cry Primal, Batman Arkham Knight, or Hitman. All reach very similar frame rates. I'm not really telling you any revolutionary news here. There are a good number of games which do not fully utilize or take advantage of a large number of cores in processors, but this is slowly starting to change, and titles like Ashes of Singularity or Crisis 3 scale rather nicely when given access to a larger number of cores. we can start to see further separation from Intel's mainstream or even AMD's Ryzen offerings. This is in part thanks to either higher core count or higher clock frequencies, which of three also tends to have a preference for those processors with higher core count too. Power users opting for HEDT might have gaming as a primary purpose, but usually this is mixed with other productivity desires, for example 3D modeling or video editing. Cinebench R15 offers a fascinating glimpse into how Skylake-X, Ryzen and Intel's mainstream offerings stack up. In these tests, the 7900X has a commanding lead of 2350 points, and the 7820X squeezing out just 1842. This is a decent lead over the Ryzen 7 1700, but considering the sheer pricing difference, I'm not sure that the cost here would warrant a decision to buy Skylake-X. And these results continue with W Prime with 98 seconds with the 1GB tests compared to 70 of its bigger brother, or the low 100 points for Ryzen. Testing with Adobe Premiere, surely a staple in many content creators' workflow, we took a short 4K video and converted it to a medium bitrate 1080p video and then measured the time in seconds. Naturally, the 7600K is the runt of the litter here, taking almost 600 seconds to finish its task, almost twice as long as the i9-7900X. To me, the telling story is the Ryzen 7 1700 pitted against the i7-7820X. Sure, there is about a minute's difference in speed, a number which of course would naturally scale with longer clips, but a mild overclock or even a faster Ryzen 7 would eat up some of that difference, making the i7-7820X's $600 price point harder to swallow if your primary purpose is to buy the CPU with video editing in Adobe Premiere in mind. When it comes to compression and decompression, Intel certainly have the lead, particularly in the 7-zip benchmark. Ryzen has a larger gap between compression and decompression, whereas Intel's results are much more consistent between both operations. Once again, the i7-7820X demolishes the lower-end Intel SKUs with the 7900X demolishing everything. FryBench is another commanding demonstration for the Skylake-X platform, and shows how happy the application is when thrown additional cores and threads, with the 7900X being about 2.5 times the speed of a 7700K, and the 7820X around half the speed. Switching things to the Intel exclusive XTU, and again, the mainstream SKUs simply cannot hold a candle to the 7820X. Finishing off, we have the synthetic tests from CPU-Z, where the 7820X and 7900X offer very similar results with single core performance, but fall behind with sheer clock speed of the 7700K. And multi-thread scores are roughly what you would expect. To summarise these results, the new mesh interconnectivity of the Skylake-X cores does cause a mixed bag of performance, with it falling behind in certain gaming workloads, slightly more noticeable on the 7820X we find than the 7900X. Fortunately, the 7820X runs a little cooler than its bigger brothers, and while we quickly hit mid-70s with our testing with the 7900X, the 7820X generally sat around the high 60s or low 70s under heavy workloads. This is with a Corsair H75 AIO. Fortunately, much like the 7900X, we didn't have much time for overclocking as the product needed to be sent back to MSI for further review seeding, but we did manage to crank the cores up to 4.5 GHz without too much problem at all. Heat quickly rose to the low 80s under load, and we suspect that with a better cooler and with more time to tweak voltages, there was a lot more room left in the processor tank, so to speak. So there we have it then, the 7820X and our opinions of it. So what do we think? Is it worth buying this processor? Well, quite honestly, it's in a very weird position in the marketplace. The main problem with this processor comes down to pricing. At around $600, it's going to be a tough sell. What do I mean by that? Well, it's priced at a point where it's not a cheap entry into the X299 platform. The pricing and value issue is what's really stopping us from fully recommending this processor. With fewer PCIe lanes, those looking to run multi-graphics cards and with a focus on I/O, you may be concerned. It's hard to make a full comparison point to Threadripper, as it's not quite out yet at the time of this review, but the 12-core 1920X will cost $800 with the 8-core 1900X pegged at just $550. With the price point of $600, the 7820X doesn't quite serve as a cheap entry into the X299 platform, but perhaps with a $50 or $100 price cut, its value would quickly improve. A quick hunt online will reveal various less featured-laden X299 motherboards at the $200 price point, which isn't terribly more than what you'd pay for a decent AMD X370 motherboard. This brings us to our recommendation. Clearly, AMD lose out in raw clock speed and core-for-core performance versus Skylake-X if you use their Ryzen CPUs. If single-thread performance is important to you, you want Optane technology or perhaps want to dabble with AVX 512, you don't mind sacrificing PCIe lanes from the higher-end Intel SKUs, then the 7820X is a more compelling purchase. We'll be very interested if we draw similar conclusions with Threadripper 1900X, since it has just as many cores as the vanilla Ryzen 7 lineup. One thing the X299 platform does illustrate is how much the value proposition has changed over its X99 cousin. Consider this: the 10-core 6950X with a turbo of 3.5 GHz retailed at just over $1,700, compared to just $1,000 of the 7900. Meanwhile, the 7820X processor retails for just $600. Not cheap, sure, but a considerable saving over the $1,100 of the 6900K. The last question mark comes down to price cuts, possibly in retaliation to the release of Threadripper and Intel's own Coffee Lake. With Intel bringing 6 cores and 12 threads to the mainstream, we suspect it would serve to shake up the landscape considerably over the next several months, and perhaps with its introduction may actually end up eating into Intel's lower-end HEDT sales. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.